Hey, AP Lang teachers, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing one of the most frequently asked questions that I receive at the beginning of each school year, and that is how do you save time grading essays in order to avoid teacher burnout? Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to stay in touch. Please check out the description box below for a link to my AP Lang teacher email list, and also don't forget to subscribe. I want to give a shout out to Stacy, Angela, and Erin. They all responded to a post I made in my Facebook group that I share with Tim Freitas called the English Coaching Garden. I'll leave a link to that in the description box below as well. Because I've covered different teacher tips like this in previous videos, it was really great to hear other people's ideas. So I wanted to be sure to extend a shout out. Let's start by talking about rubrics. Now, if you're familiar with AP Lang, you know that the College Board provides rubrics for each of the FRQs. Now, I think these rubrics can be helpful in certain ways during the year. I do use them in my classroom. However, something to consider would be to make your own rubric, especially for those frequent assignments. For instance, one of the things that I have my students do throughout the school year is I have them write a thesis statement. So I have a really quick rubric, it's just 5 points, that I use to assess their thesis statements. I have a similar rubric that I use for paragraphs because, as we'll talk about later on in this video, I like to give paragraphs as a short assignment instead of just leading up to an essay right away. The more you use the same rubric, the easier it is for students to understand the expectations, and it saves you time as a teacher. So you might need to spend a little bit of time creating the rubric up front just to make sure that it meets your needs and your students' needs. But overall, rubrics can help you save time. And once you have one done, not only can you use it this year, you can also use it in future years. It can also be really helpful to give students a checklist to consult before they turn in their work. So this is kind of like a rubric. However, I think sometimes a checklist is easier to create. So I like to create these in the assignment instructions. And my students are pretty used to looking at the checklist before they actually submit. Now, if you're looking for a sample rubric that is based off of the College Board ideas, but is maybe a little bit more student friendly, check out the description box below for a rubric from my friend Amy. She shared this rubric with me a couple weeks ago, and I posted about it in a previous video, and I've had so many teachers reach out and say that they have found it really helpful. So thank you, Amy, for sharing your rubric with us. If you're curious about that video, I'll link it in the description box below as well. I've been very fortunate to team up with some of my fellow AP readers and do a Zoom roundtable discussion. We've done 2 of them so far, and Amy mentioned the rubric in our last one. So be sure to check out those videos, especially if you are a relatively new AP Lang teacher, because between the 6 of us, we have lots of tips in those videos. Now, I've already mentioned shorter assignments, but this is one of my go-to methods for not burning out as a teacher. And this is actually something I learned the hard way because when I first started my teaching career, I had students writing quite a lot of essays quite early in the year. And then I realized something. I was putting the same feedback from one paragraph to the next, one essay to the next, and I thought, you know what, there has got to be a better way to do this. So I went back to basics, and it has tremendously helped not only me as the teacher, but it's helped my students as well. So some examples of shorter assignments would be things like thesis statements. Thesis statements can be great for bell work or an entry ticket. It can even be an exit ticket or homework. And you can even have this be a completion grade. There is nothing wrong with a completion grade. I also like to have my students write topic sentences. So sometimes I'll have them do a thesis statement and the topic sentences. This helps them practice their line of reasoning, and it helps them practice writing a claim. To expand upon that a little bit more, you could have students write an outline. Sometimes I have them write the outline as a pre-writing step before we write a paragraph or an essay, but other times I just have them write the outline. And part of the reason is if they can outline all of their ideas and they write a good outline, I can follow their line of reasoning and I don't necessarily need for them to write the essay. There's definitely a time and a place for writing essays, but sometimes I just want my students to practice that line of reasoning. I want to know that they're thinking about how everything fits together, and they can achieve that with an outline. Some other shorter assignments might be things like one-pagers, and like I said before, body paragraphs. I love having students write just a body paragraph because it allows me to set up the expectations I have. I found that oftentimes when students come into my class, their idea of a body paragraph and mine are two different things. So by having them practice, I can give them feedback on the paragraph level. And then when they do write an essay, they understand the expectations and their writing is much better. It's also a lot easier to grade paragraphs than it is to grade essays. Now let's talk about providing feedback. Now, I don't necessarily intend for you to implement all of these tips, but think about the ones that would be most useful to you. I know a lot of teachers out there use a comment bank or comment codes. I have a comment bank on Google Classroom, and sometimes it really does streamline the process, especially for comments that I intend to use for multiple students on multiple assignments. I personally like the glow and grow feedback method. My friend Amy, who I mentioned earlier, has a similar method. She calls it plus and delta. So the delta just means to change or improve. It's really the same concept though. Basically, for me, I give them a glow, which is something that they did well, and a grow, which is something that they can improve upon. So they get at least one of each, sometimes two of each. It just kind of depends. Now, with the glow, I try to focus on something that we've been talking about in class that they've done well, and also something that I know the individual student is working on. With the grow, I try to ask myself, what is the thing that is going to improve their essay the most? So I don't nitpick all the grammar and all the spelling. I did do that as a first year teacher, but I realized it was probably a waste of my time. So instead, I tailor my grow feedback to their content. Usually it's their commentary. Now, something else you might try for feedback is using Mote. My friend Sarah uses this and she also does video messages to her students. So, if that's your thing, that can be a great option for giving your students specific individual feedback, and recording it sometimes does not take as long as writing it, depending on your process. Something else to consider is student sample slides. Now, there's a couple ways that you can do this. One would be to choose a student sample from your own students. I would recommend keeping it anonymous. And in some cases, if you have multiple classes, you might choose a sample from a different class. That way, the person's not in the room. I also like to try to choose positive samples. I like to use this as a way to build students up and highlight what someone is doing well. You can also use samples from the College Board. So, for instance, if a lot of my students, for instance, let's say that you have students who are writing limited commentary, but you don't want to put one of your own students' essays up there. Find an essay sample from the same prompt or a similar one from the College Board and use that sample. This will allow you to highlight the issue that you want students to improve upon, and once they see it in the sample, then they can apply it to their own writing. So think of this as like collective group feedback. Think about the things that your students are doing well and the things that collectively they need to work on, and provide sample slides accordingly. Now, here are some general tips. First of all, you don't have to grade everything. I know of plenty of teachers who have their students write and they don't always assign it a grade. Or in my case, I prefer to do completion grades. That acknowledges that they put the work in, but it's not necessarily giving them content feedback. Also, when I say you don't have to grade everything, I mean that you don't have to grade every single spelling mistake or grammar mistake. So, for example, let's say that you have your students do a paragraph writing assignment. Ask yourself what you've been talking about in class. Have you been really focusing on commentary? If so, grade those paragraphs for the quality of their commentary. You don't have to focus on every single thing that they do right or wrong in their paragraph, just focus on one component. By focusing on one thing, you are not only helping yourself avoid burnout, but also by focusing on one element, you are giving your students less to focus on themselves, which means they are more likely to take your feedback and use it to improve. One tip that has helped me is to do grading bursts, which means I grade maybe 5 to 10 essays at a time. Part of the reason why I do this is because I know sometimes I get tired and I want to make sure that I'm giving my students fresh eyes and equal caliber feedback. It also is weirdly refreshing to me because it's less agonizing to sit down and say, okay, I'm just going to score 5 essays, as opposed to looking at the entire stack on my desk. There are also times when I use the Pomodoro method, which is basically you do a task for 25 minutes and then you give yourself a 5-minute break. Something else that sometimes helps me, especially when I feel like I have multiple assignments to grade for multiple classes, is I grade the shorter assignments first. So that would be things like the thesis statements or just completion grades in general. Maybe I'll grade their bell work. If I assign some kind of activity on Common Lit that pretty much scores it for you, I might enter that in the grade book. Basically, if you feel like you're stressing out, grade the easier assignments. That way you can feel like you've accomplished something. And also, students like to see those grades being entered in the gradebook as well. That way you can make sure that you're in the right headspace to tackle those essays later. Another way to save time grading is to eventually crowdsource it to your students. Now, hear me out on this. I don't do this right away in this school year. And there are different approaches that you can use. You can do a small group writing workshop, which is what my friend Erica does. She mentioned this in our previous video that I was talking about earlier. I'll link that one in the description box below. I personally like to do peer exchanges, and I let my students choose which peer they want to get feedback from. Before you have your students peer edit, regardless of which method you're trying, make sure that you have shown them what quality feedback is, because students need to know what they're supposed to be looking for. Something else to consider is, just like I said earlier, that as a teacher, you don't have to grade everything. Break it down as simply as you can for your students. Give them a checklist or a broken down rubric, or just have them look for a few specific things. Because if students don't know what to comment on, then they're more likely to say, oh, this is a good paper. If you want them to give quality constructive feedback, then they need to know what they're supposed to be looking for. I also find it helps to give them the opportunity to peer edit smaller assignments first. That way they get used to it before you ever have them peer edit an actual essay. Something else to consider is that some teachers like to have their students do anonymous peer edits, so you could do that as well. And for what it's worth, I usually give my students a completion grade for peer editing. You can also have your students self-score their essays. Once students are comfortable with the rubric and expectations, you can have them self-score, and I would have them provide an explanation of their score. This would be similar to the rationales that the College Board provides. When you receive the assignment, then you can determine if their score that they gave themselves is accurate. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, wait a minute, what if students score themselves too high? I've found that that's not usually the case. If anything, my students tend to be harder on themselves. Or sometimes they give themselves the score that they've gotten from me because they feel like that's a safe score. However, if you have them write a detailed rationale using the rubric where they really have to defend their score, then I have found that students are usually spot on. And because they're self-scoring, they start to realize, ooh, I didn't elaborate enough here, or oh, my line of reasoning is faulty here. And so they're seeing those mistakes and they're internalizing it and taking ownership of it, which helps them in the writing process. Because it's kind of different when they can see it themselves as opposed to me, their teacher, telling them. Now let's talk about revisions. It's up to you what you want to allow your students to revise and how frequently you want to allow for revisions. Personally, I don't allow for it very often during the year because I feel like if I have multiple assignments building up to the larger assignments, my students tend to do pretty well. That being said, usually when it's their first major timed write, I do allow for a revision, and I do that for each of the FRQs. Also, as the exam approaches, I tend to offer the opportunity to revise. Not all my students take it, but some of them do. And for me, I tend to put it as a separate grade in the grade book, and it's a completion grade instead of changing their original score. However, I know some teachers do that as well. So again, that part is up to you and what works best for your students. Now you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. I thought this was a time-saving video. Revisions are more work. And I hear you on that. But here's why I think it can be helpful. And here's how you can save time with the revisions. One of the things that I have my students do when I allow them to revise is I make sure that they highlight the new material. So anything that is new or a meaningful change, I have them highlight it. I also have them write a paragraph, and it has to be a detailed paragraph where they reflect on the process and they tell me what they changed and why. So for the revisions, I don't technically rescore their essay. I just look for, did they improve? And did they focus on the changes that I had suggested in my original feedback? It's easy to see the changes because it's highlighted, and then just looking at the paragraph reflection tells me what I need to know. So it's not adding too much to my plate, but it is meaningful for my students, especially when the revisions are optional, because then I know if they chose to revise, they likely took it seriously. All right, AP Lang teachers, there you have it. Those are my top tips for saving time, grading essays, and avoiding teacher burnout. Let me know in the comments what your favorite tips were from this video, or if you have a tip that I did not share that helps save you time when you're grading essays, let us know that in the comments below as well. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy teaching!